Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Looking forward to speaking with Youki Terada, who's the Research and Standards Editor at Edutopia. Yuki does really interesting work, and I'd recommend him as someone for you to follow. We're going to talk to him a little bit more about his job and the nature of vetting the research that Edutopia just chooses to share out with its audience of educators. But the main reason why we brought Yuki on is that he did a really nice summary of the research, educational research in 2019 that Dan and I did a show on at the end of 2019. Got really good uptake, and it allowed me to reach out to Yuki, and lo and behold, we were able to book him for the show. So Yuki, welcome to Trending in Education.
Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, and can you begin by talking a little bit about Edutopia and what Edutopia's mission is and how educational research comes to bear on the mission?
Yeah, so Edutopia is an educational nonprofit, and our main goal is to transform K-12 education to help all students succeed. Not just succeed in the classroom, but also succeed outside the classroom in their careers, in their lives as adults. And the way we do that is by producing content for educators to listen to and to read. So most of what we do, most of our articles are written by teachers who share practices that they find effective. And behind the scenes, we have a whole team of editors, and we have me, our research editor, who vets everything to make sure that what we're sharing is vetted and high quality.
Yeah, and in 2020, because it is 2020 now, you know, it's really easy to share something that seems interesting based on a headline or based on something that you think might get clicks or likes or shares. And it's not always based on evidence-based research. And as I understand, your job for Edutopia is to make sure that whatever is shared out is actually based on real science. Can you talk a little bit about what that's like and how that can be challenging based on the types of articles, types of research that your writers and your audience is interested in?
Yeah, sure. So my background is actually in educational research. I've been at Edutopia for about 7 years. I started off as a researcher, so I understand how to design an educational study fairly well. Before this, I was at the Lawrence Hall of Science, studying informal science learning. Before that, I was at Berkeley for grad and undergrad. So I'm able to read a research study. I'm able to understand not just a research study itself, but also the context, like what publication is it in? Is it peer reviewed? What's the impact factor? Is it a high quality study? Is the research itself high quality? So I take a lot of that training into my job here, where I look at pretty much every piece of content that we put out. And I make sure that if anything goes out, that it's highly vetted and that it is backed by evidence. Because as we know, teachers are extremely intelligent. They're very smart, and they're very critical, because part of our job as educators is to help students understand how to be critical thinkers. So I always expect to be called out if any of the content that we put out isn't high quality and has a lot of research supporting it.
Yeah. And interestingly, when we were prepping, you were talking about the mission of Edutopia, which is very much about the practical application of evidence-based research. Could you talk a little bit about that? Like how you need to make sure that the research is valid, but then even beyond that, you do need to also vet that the application in a classroom is also relevant, which involves, I imagine, a little bit of critical thinking and other tools. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, exactly. We very, very rarely put out content that is purely about the research, because for us, it's about connecting research to practice. And one good example of that is our video series, our Schools at Work video series where we actually go into schools and classrooms and we film what's working. And behind the scenes, there's a lot of vetting that happens. We take a close look at schools, the practices and strategies that are happening at schools, and make sure that um, with a high level of confidence, we can say that these practices and strategies actually contribute to the success of the school. That it's not just, you know, like a superstar teacher who can pretty much do anything and have his or her students succeed. That there's research and there's evidence supporting the actual practice. Because what we want ultimately is for our audience, our teachers, to be able to see something on Edutopia and to be able to implement it into their own classrooms. That's the main goal. So everything we do is kind of pointed at that main goal. So part of my job isn't just to present research, but to also show how that research can inform good teaching. How research can make you a more how research can help you understand better how students learn, what learning is, and how classroom practices can be improved.
Yeah, and I will say, as someone who regularly follows what Edutopia is putting out there, while it's intended specifically for K-12, a lot of the research is relevant in a broader set of contexts. So I would say, certainly if you're in the K-12 space, if you're an educator, I would encourage you to check out what Edutopia is doing, track Youki down on Twitter and all those things. But I'd also say, despite the focus scope of your mission, a lot of the research, I think, has broader application to higher ed, to informal learning, and to a lot of the other topics that we talk about on the show. So, so good job by you. We did showcase at the end of 2019 the article that you published on Edutopia about the research highlights from 2019. Had a really interesting conversation. It's a pretty broad survey, and we were happy to say that we did cover maybe about half of the research topics that you were describing in the article. I'd love to hear from your perspective, you know, maybe looking back a bit at the year that was. What research really resonated the most with you? Where did you see science moving the needle in a way that could actually impact K-12 educators in their classrooms?
Yeah, so there are a few things that I'm really excited about for 2019, what happened in 2019. And one of them is looking at the arts. Because for years and for decades even, we've heard a lot about why the arts is so important. And we've heard a lot about why arts programs and extracurricular art programs are so important for learning. But what we're seeing now is we're seeing the reasons why the arts are so important. And one reason why is because it is fundamentally tied to learning. So for example, one of the studies that came out last year was looking at the impact of drawing on learning and how when you draw something, you're more likely to remember it. And that sounds, so it's not necessarily the reason, it's not necessarily that art itself helps learning, but understanding exactly why and the reasons why drawing something is beneficial. And neuroscience actually sheds a lot of light onto why the arts are important. And that's because when you experience something and when you are trying to learn something, when you encode it in multiple ways, you're more likely to remember it. So for example, if you just see something, you're much less likely to remember it than if you see it and hear it or see it and feel it. But one of the kind of the thing that ties everything together with drawing, kind of the linchpin, is the elaborative process. So when you see something and you draw it, the actual act of drawing it forces you to elaborate on what it means. And let me kind of give you an example. So the human brain is really efficient, and it's really good at, people are really good at tricking themselves into thinking they know something when they don't. So for example, if I ask you to, let's say, picture a bicycle, okay? Picture what a bicycle looks like. And if I ask you to draw it, most people, the vast majority of people cannot draw a bicycle correctly. you know, they'll get the basic parts right, you know, the wheels, the handlebars, the seat. But once you get to, you know, where the crossbar goes, where all the different bars go, most people can't actually draw it because even though everyone knows what the bicycle looks like, it's very rare for someone to actually be able to elaborate on what the bicycle actually looks like. It's not until you actually try to design a bicycle and make sure you have it correctly and make sure that it works structurally, that, you know, if someone's actually sitting on the seat, that it doesn't just fall apart. It's not until you actually elaborate on the process that you begin to really understand what the bicycle looks like. And once you start to understand that, you know, the weight of the seat, if the weight isn't evenly distributed across the whole bicycle and you don't have the correct shape, typically, you know, the seat is directly above the rear wheel. And then you have triangles. You have two sets of triangles that support the handlebar and both wheels. But until you actually like elaborate on that process, you don't really know what a bicycle looks like. So part of what's exciting to me is that we have a better understanding now of not just why the arts are important, but what it actually means to learn something and what it actually means to remember something and to have a better understanding of what it means to take something from short-term memory to long-term memory and have students actually understand what they're learning instead of just tricking themselves into thinking they understand what they're learning.
Yeah, and you know, just extending what you're talking about, I could see how that would have direct impact on an educator coming up with her lesson plan on either teaching geometry or physics, or, you know, there's plenty of practical applications to the bicycle example that you just put out there. And also there's a bit of an aha moment in terms of realizing that when you try to draw a bicycle that you would draw it wrong. Like that's an opportunity to learn right there as well. Cause then you can say, well, let's see how everyone drew this. Oh, that's interesting. Many of you drew it this way. Let's talk about that. And you could see how it's both engaging their creative selves, it's engaging their maybe different aspects of their brain than if they were just leaning back and being lectured at. But it's also a way to sort of engage a class and you know, create sort of that active exchange that really is conducive to learning.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so I don't think I included this in the article, but one of the more interesting connections to make with art and drawing is that in a way, when you draw something, it's kind of like a practice test. And we know that practice tests in general are very effective for learning. We know that, you know, if you just, you know, sit at the front of the classroom and lecture at students, they'll probably forget most of what you say. But if you reinforce that learning with practice tests throughout the school year, their students are much more likely to actually remember what they're trying to learn. And one of the reasons for that is because there's a difference between encoding memory and decoding memories. And when you encode information, the goal is to make it stick into long-term memory so that students remember it throughout the school year, not just for, you know, the week, not just, you know, between the day before they study for a test and right after. You don't want them to forget everything they've learned right after. So it's really important not just to help students remember things, but to actually be able to make the learning actually stick, to make the information stick. And one of the most effective ways to do that is to help them practice actually recalling that information periodically, not just once, not just right after a lesson, but throughout the school year. So when someone draws something, it's kind of like a mini practice test in a way, because you're asking them to not only like look at something, you're asking them not only to like, okay, here's, for example, like a model of the solar system, you know, here are the different planets. You're actually asking them to encode it into their short-term memories and then to decode it, to recall it. And that the act of doing that actually helps with recall in the future. So like a lot of things that don't seem connected end up being very connected, because we know there are some fundamental mechanisms for how students learn. One of which is that it's very easy to think you know something when you don't, and it's very important to not only just teach something once, but to teach it in multiple ways, to teach it, you know, distributed practice, to teach it throughout the school year, to give students multiple opportunities to learn something.
Yeah, and different ways of engaging. I love the example of the arts too, because when you're in your bicycle example, actually a solar system as well, like you're using the artistic instinct to teach science or to teach math, you know, which is why, you know, I'm always a big fan of the the A in STEAM, you know, like like uh, trying to design for an integrated learning experience where, you know, it's not like when you're doing science, you know, you shut off the artistic or visual parts of your brain. If anything, it's better to engage across the different aspects of your brain and your neuroscience when engaging in these types of things.
Yeah.
Um,
One of the fascinating examples I recently came across is I'm currently researching a topic, procrastination, and I was reading about Leonardo da Vinci, famous procrastinator, known for never finishing a project. But he was well known for he was quite well known for his art. But we also know that he invented the helicopter and the
yep,
parachute. And what I
yep.
found very interesting was that they actually don't work. They're not functional. And the
Hmm.
reason why is because he invented them for the theater. He was inventing props
Huh.
for the theater. So one of the reasons why he invented these things that allowed us to better understand kind of like flight and better understand mechanics is because of the arts, because he wasn't inventing them for invention's sake, but he was trying to figure out like how 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 do the arts
Hmm.
how do the arts fit into what I'm trying to develop.
Hmm. That's
um,
fascinating. And you better finish that article on procrastination because that's a good tease. You got me with Da Vinci and the arts because that's some good stuff. Any other trends you're noticing just around educational research writ large? Any?
oh yeah, I mean
Yeah.
like every year or every few years we gain a better, more nuanced understanding of something that we previously held to be, pretty bulletproof and true. And the example last year in 2019 was the research on summer slide. And
Hmm.
previously we've seen things like the marshmallow test, learning styles. We see these big ideas where I wouldn't necessarily say that they were wrong, but that we have a better, more nuanced understanding of them.
Hmm.
And with summer slide, it turns out that the summer slide was very much, in a way, manufactured by the test taking methodology. So if you can imagine 10 people taking a test, um, and each test has 10 questions, and on average, half of the people get half of the questions right. You can kind of quantify that. So the average would be 50%, right? But we don't score tests that way. Tests are usually scored using a weighted system. So the more questions that a student gets right, the harder the questions get. So what you're seeing is that when you compare two different tests, it's not an apples to apples comparison. It can be an apples to oranges comparison depending on what kind of testing methodology is used. So what we're finding out now is that a lot of the assumptions that we made about the summer slide, a lot of the assumptions we made about how tests change over the summer were incorrect.
Hmm.
And that a researcher can create any kind of gap that they want because it's no longer it's not really true that the number of questions that a student gets correct is the score that they get.
Hmm.
So I think it's just what actually ends up happening is that the gap exists pretty early on and it persists.
Hmm.
So there isn't kind of like a widening of the gap over the summer and then closing of the gap once the school
Hmm.
year starts. That gap starts pretty much in kindergarten, and it actually persists and grows slightly larger throughout all the way through high school.
Yeah.
So I like that we're seeing kind of a more nuanced understanding.
Yeah, and
Of,
it's sort of a reminder that science continues to evolve and revise itself, and that as humans, we gravitate to narrative and to almost lore at times,
right.
so that you want to tell the story of this research in a way that everybody understands. And you were mentioning before, frequently you learn something as science maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, and then the science evolves, but if unless you're exposed to services like what you're providing at Edutopia, unless you're a lifelong learner who's continuing to revisit these things, that knowledge can get crystallized to the point that you're not able to revisit it, and what was once true is in fact no longer true. Doesn't mean science doesn't work. In fact, it's the opposite. It means that science is working. But the challenge, I think, for educators is to continue to revisit things that you learned to be true earlier in your life, and be open and flexible to the fact that they may change as the body of research continues to grow.
Right. Anecdotal evidence is very powerful, and it's
Mm-hmm.
very easy to fit science around that. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, a lot of the brain myths that we're used to that are no longer true, like, you know, you only use 10% of your brain,
Mm-hmm.
or that uh, uh, boys and girls have different brains. Like one of the studies that came out last year looked at the actual wiring of boys and girls' brains as they did math problems. And it turns out that there's really no functional difference between the boy's brain and the girl's brain. And that a lot of the differences that we see are actually culturally constructed. And that what makes a bigger impact isn't necessarily kind of like how a boy's brain is wired versus how a girl's brain is wired, but our own cultural assumptions and attitudes towards boys and girls in math and science. And that has a much bigger impact. And kind of one of the counterexamples we see is that, you know, this idea that boys are better in math isn't true across, you know, all countries. There are countries where we see parity or even girls doing better in math. To me, it's really great that we have these assumptions about how the brain works and how learning works. And science every year sheds new light on our understanding and makes us revise our thinking, makes us revise how we understand learning. And I think, for example, learning styles, like we were talking about learning styles earlier, I think learning styles is a great example of that. And you said something like, you know, does learning styles exist? And to me, that's the question people tend to ask. You know, does learning styles exist? Are learning styles real or not? And to me, that's really the wrong question, because to me, we define learning styles in whatever way we want to define learning styles. It's not like an actual thing that you can study in the human brain. So learning styles exists if you say it exists. That doesn't necessarily mean it's real. For me, the better question is there anything that a teacher can do with respect to learning styles? And the answer turns out to be no. When we try to align instruction to a particular learning style, it turns out that tends to not have any positive benefits for students. That if you think a student is a visual learner and you present only kind of like pictures and images to them, that isn't necessarily better than showing them a multimodal way, like showing things multimodally, because we know that learning things in multiple ways helps students encode the information better. So for me, it's almost irrelevant whether or not learning styles is true. What's more important is there anything we can do as educators to help students? And it turns out that actually learning styles can actually be harmful, because if you start to label students as, you know, a visual thinker or a kinesthetic thinker or learner, you can potentially box them in, or possibly even worse, they can develop a kind of a fixed attitude towards that type of learning, where they think, oh, you know, since I'm a visual learner, I'm not going to even bother with all these other types of learning. So, I mean, you don't want to categorize students and to box them in and to label them, because that can be harmful.
No, it's fascinating stuff. How do you stay abreast of all this stuff? So you're pulling stuff out of midair on the fly right now. A lot of research going on. Obviously, one way for the rest of us to stay abreast of what's going on in educational research is to follow folks like yourself. But are there any tips you have around like resources to look at, or ways to stay frosty, I like to say, ways to stay alert and aware of what's going on around you?
Yeah, so I think for probably the best tip for me is to subscribe to newsletters, because then the information comes to you. The information is kind of curated in a sense, so you don't have to worry about, because for my position, like if I write an article on one study, I've probably looked at, you know, 20 or 30 studies I've decided not to cover 20 or 30 studies, or even more. So like I go through quite a lot to find a study that I would like to report on. And that's not something that you want to do as a teacher, because your time is precious. Unless it's specifically part of your job, like you teach educational research or something, you probably don't want to go through all the different journals, go through all the different studies. It's a lot more helpful to go to sites like Edutopia, who will do that for you. So I like newsletters, for example, like NPR Education, Mindshift, EdWeek. Those are Hackinger. Those are really good sites because they have a really high bar when it comes to reporting on research.
Yeah, and it reminds me also of the idea of digital literacies too. Like, so understanding, getting back to the idea of fake news or fake science, like, trust your sources, go to primary sources when you can. And if you don't have the time, because many of us are busy, particularly if you're a teacher in a classroom, find trusted curators who are doing good work. So, and that's also something that I have found, folks like yourself are somewhat generous, both in terms of what you're providing, but also in saying, like, we're not the only people who are providing this type of value. There are plenty of services out there, and playing with your head up and having some savvy around what doesn't necessarily pass the smell test, in terms of something just pops up in your feed from a source you've never seen before, and there's not even a citation of the primary research that it's based on. If you do a little bit of digging, that's certainly a red flag.
Yeah, I mean, so often an article comes across on Facebook, or Twitter, and on its surface, it looks like a good study. Like this actually happened pretty recently. There was a study on air quality, and the study was looking at so in a California city, there was a gas problem. The city, in response, decided to install air filters into schools to try to counteract the gas problem. But what turned out happening was that by the time they actually installed the air filters, the gas problem was gone, because it took like a year or so. So this gave researchers an opportunity to kind of investigate whether or not air filters can improve test scores. If you look at the radius of schools inside the nearest the gas facility that had the leak, compared to those outside of the radius. So this was widely shared, and on its surface it looked like a good study, but when I read it more closely, and when I read the actual study, there were like pretty fundamental flaws with the study itself. The sample size is really small. The data points, there weren't enough data points. It was a very controversial study. But if you just read everything on Facebook at face value, you can get tripped up. It's much better to either have the first-hand information to be able to analyze the study, or to look at sites who do vet information, like Edutopia.
Yeah. I mean, it's really an age where we all need to rely on trusted curation, and finding those sources is so critical, because no one has time to really do the hard work of vetting all this that you're doing. So like, you have time, but not everyone else does. So that's why it's great that you're doing this work, and it's important for people to find those opportunities. We're coming close to time, so I would love to. We talked about looking backwards. I'd love to get your take on what might be emerging. The 2020s are just starting, and it's very futuristic sci-fi. We're ready for flying cars and Matrix-style educational downloads. So those things may be a little bit beyond the pale, but what's exciting your imagination around the trend lines that we're seeing heading into this next decade?
For me, what's exciting is the science of learning. Which is making more connections between how students learn to how we understand how the brain works. So making connections to like cognitive science, to psychology, to neuroscience, and really gaining a better understanding of making better connections between what's happening in the classroom and what's happening outside of the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, we've right now we've heard a lot about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and we know that the more ACEs that a child experiences, the lower the chances of their success as adults. We know that what happens to a child has an impact on their life outcomes down the line. But all of that has been observational. A lot of that has been just like observing, groups of people, looking at what's happening, from like 0 to 12 years of age, and the outcomes as they're adults. But what I'm excited about is that we're gaining a better understanding of how the brain works, how brain development happens, and how things like relationships. It's not just this kind of like this nebulous idea that relationships are important, but we're actually seeing that when kids are young and they're in a safe, supportive environment with lots of healthy relationships, that their brains actually develop in a different way compared to if they live in poverty or if they live under trauma. And I think what's exciting is just having a better understanding of how things like trauma can inform education and teaching and learning.
Yeah, and it does seem like we're sort of on the precipice of meaningful breakthroughs in terms of actionable, like getting back to the mission of Edutopia, actionable insights about how the brain operates. So like rather, there's always been really interesting research. I remember I was also a psychology student growing up, and split brain research, right brain, left brain, like all that stuff is fascinating. But when you think about the practical applications, frequently there wasn't as much of a way to connect that. It does seem like we're on the verge of making more of those types of connections in the coming years, and that certainly is exciting. Any other trends that you're noting, whether it's within education or more broadly, that you think are worth paying extra attention to, or any recent research that you've seen? 2020. There'll be a 2020 year in review at the end of the year. January is almost under our belts. Anything catching your attention that you wanted to share with our listeners before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'm excited about AI, artificial intelligence, and this is a pretty tricky kind of topic, because there's kind of like, for me, there are different types of AI. So there's kind of the more kind of obvious AI, which is kind of like the robot in front of the classroom doing the teaching. And that's kind of the way AI is portrayed often in media, kind of like we should all fear AI because it's going to take all our jobs away. But for me, like that's kind of, it's a straw man. It's like a boogeyman. It's not really what AI is about. For me, what's exciting about AI is being able to understand large sets of data and understand patterns in that data. For example, let's say you want to understand and predict whether or not a student will drop out of high school. Like currently, we have pretty either crude tools to do that or highly intensive tools to do that. Either you're sitting down with a student, talking to them, getting to know them, or we have like really crude data points, like grades and attendance. But for me, one of the one of the potentials of AI, what makes it promising, is that it can help us better understand and predict and analyze large data sets. So for example, if you're looking at a group of students and you're kind of churning through all the data, like what patterns can we see in the data? Not just looking at like test scores and attendance, but what patterns can you see in terms of like, like how, like what kind of supports do they have in the family? Like what kind of experiences they have as in their childhood? What kind of patterns can AI predict that will help us maybe better anticipate kind of issues that we might find with students? That way, we don't necessarily address those issues, but it can help us kind of reveal patterns and help us better understand, like, okay, who might need a little bit more help, who might need more support, who should we like pay a little bit of extra attention to? Because it's really hard, if you have a classroom with 30 students and you have 5 classrooms, it's really hard to pay full attention to 150 students. But I'm hoping that down the line we can have more tools to be able to not let any students fall through the cracks, and I think AI can help with that.
Maybe catch some of that stuff early too, right? So like, rather than frequently by the time an intervention is clearly needed, it's almost too late. And if the behavioral patterns and the data points that you're describing can signal things early enough so that the right kind of intervention can be done, there certainly is a lot of promise to that.
Right. So I mean, for me, ultimately, it's really about helping teachers become more informed and giving them kind of a better understanding of their students.
Yeah. Fantastic conversation. Really appreciate you taking the time, Youki. If folks want to follow you or understand what you're doing at Edutopia, what's the best way for them to stay on top of all this?
Oh, so I'm on Twitter, Youki Terada, just one word. Yeah, ask me any question on Twitter. I'm always happy to answer.
Awesome. So Edutopia is a great resource, particularly for K12 educators, but for folks who are just interested in learning and research and education, I'd certainly recommend it. I'd also recommend Yuki's work. And thanks again, Youki, for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. Glad to be here.
And for our listeners, we'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.